his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar," I practiced that too, Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they that might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Please.
We are so blessed to be together today and to have the opportunity to just see each other and to bring God our very best as we join together and worship him. We're looking at this whole idea of God's revealed glory that we see in the life of Jesus. And so what we see is, as we look at the events of Jesus' life, we see not only who he is, but we also see who God is. And so we've looked at the very idea that God is this one who wants to come into our lives and heal us. Heal us from our brokenness. Heal us from just the problems of this world. But not just from a physical way. What we have seen is that through the very life of Jesus, he wants to come in, as we saw last week, and heal us spiritually. To heal us and give us forgiveness of our sins. And so we want to continue to look at that this morning as we think about the very idea of the glory that is revealed in the life of Jesus. Jeff, if you wouldn't mind, switch over to the other computer. I want to ask you this morning, in everyday life, how do you know that you are good at something? You might say, well, in sports, it's based off of how many trophies you or your team have. That sort of says, oh, okay, they're good at that. In your job, maybe it is your performance reviews. It's wondering, okay, how have you achieved the benchmarks that might be set for you in your job? In parenting, it might be that you look at your children's behavior, and does that behavior conform to maybe what the culture has set as good behavior? Have you noticed, though, in all those things, we like to measure things. We like to measure this by this to sort of get a sense of, are we good at this? So now, how do you know that you are a good person? Our default is to say, well, let me measure that by what I have done. But when we look at the life of Jesus, that's not what he shows us. He shows us something completely different. And what we're going to see today is the glory of God in the way that Jesus deals with the Sabbath. Now, as you're thinking about it, you're like, wow, okay, Adam, that was an introduction, but how in the world are you going to tie your introduction in with the Sabbath? Well, bear with me, and we'll get there. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 2. We're going to look at the very latter part of Mark chapter 2 and go into Mark chapter 3 as we look at this idea of religion versus the glorious gospel. And this is all about the idea of the Sabbath. So I want to just sort of set the stage for us about what is it that we're going to be looking at. The Sabbath for the Jews was not just a day where you didn't do any work. It was in many ways the very thing that defined who they were as a people, as a nation. And that was both good and bad. I mean, we can look through history and see times where there were other nations who came in and conquered the Jews on the Sabbath because they knew they wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't work. And so Jesus is looking at this, and what we see is the Jews, while they set aside this day as to do no work, they went beyond what God had intended. And so Mark places for us two Sabbath, we'll call them scuffles, with Jesus and the Pharisees. And the first is, it's this idea as we look at this of Jesus is going to sort of hound on this question, what is lawful or legal? And so what we see is Jesus and his disciples are walking through the grain fields on a Sabbath day. And they begin to just pick up some grain in their hands and begin to eat it. And the Pharisees are coming along and they are saying, why are you doing this? This is not lawful. It's not lawful according to their rabbinic traditions. Jesus responds with recounting what David did. And he says, aren't you aware of what David did? How David is on the run. We won't take the time to read all this, but in 1 Samuel 21, David is on the run from Saul. And he goes then to the house of God, and Abiathar is there, and he says, hey, do you have anything to eat? And Abiathar says, well, all we really have is just this bread that we use in worship of God, the bread of the presence. What they would do is they would cook this bread, and they would have it up in the place of worship for about a week. And then they would pull it out, and then they would make new bread. Well, they just pulled out the old bread, and Abiathar says, this is all we have. And David says, okay, great, give it to me so I can eat, and my men can eat with me. Well, it was illegal for David to eat it. It was only reserved for the priest to eat. Now, this is the story that Jesus gives. It has nothing to do with Sabbath, but it has a whole lot to do with that which is lawful or legal. We see next, Mark gives us a second scuffle, if you will. Jesus is in a synagogue on a Sabbath day, and he looks around and he sees this man who has a withered hand. And Jesus then asks the question, is it lawful, is it legal to do good or harm on the Sabbath? The Pharisees are silent. They don't say anything. And so what we see is that Jesus heals this man's hand, this withered hand. But what the text tells us is that Jesus is angry and distressed. Now this is something new that we haven't seen this from Jesus, at least in the text through Mark. He's angry. And the anger here, many commentators said that this is fury on an epic scale. So think about that. Fury on an epic scale. And then he is distressed, or the idea here is he is grieved, like you have just lost someone close to you. So he is angered and he is grieved. And we say, well, why? Well, the text tells us that it is because of the stubbornness of the hearts of the Pharisees. But if we dig a little bit deeper, Jesus deals with stubbornness. He deals with stubbornness in the hearts of his disciples, and he doesn't get angry like this. So there's something deeper that is going on. There's something that we need to look further at. So let's just sort of think about this idea of Sabbath versus man. The Sabbath was a day of rest. The Torah said, rest one day out of every 7. But over time, the Jewish leaders began to put hedges around the Sabbath. They actually came up with 39 different categories of unlawful work on the Sabbath. Let me just give you those 39. You cannot do these things: carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, marking. They had all of these were categories of things that you could not do on the Sabbath. Let me give you just one example. The Jewish leader said you cannot tie a knot on the Sabbath. That would be considered work. With the exception that a woman could tie a knot in her clothing. So, if you had a bucket of water that was to be raised from a well, you could not tie a rope on the bucket. But a woman could tie her clothing to the bucket. That's what they said. And so what we see here is that when the disciples are going along and just grabbing some grain, they are already violating reaping, threshing, and winnowing. The Pharisees see this as you have done something that is unlawful or illegal in God's eyes. Yet Jesus' example of David showed that human need is more important than the religious rituals. And then consider just what the day of rest was all about. It was about restoring the diminished. It was about repairing the broken. Think about it. If you just work for 6 days in a row, don't you just need a break? Our bodies aren't meant to go 24/7. And when you think about it, what happens when you just sit down and rest? Well, the body naturally starts to repair itself. That's what this day was about. A time to replenish and refresh. And so when Jesus sees this man whose hand is withered, he is saying, that's exactly what the Sabbath is for. Let me restore this man's hand. And yet the Pharisees saw it much differently. Another rule that the Pharisees had is if you were to cut your finger on the Sabbath, you could stop the bleeding, but you could not put ointment on the cut. The idea is that you could stop it from getting worse, but you couldn't make it better. But again, that's what Jesus is saying. You see that these men were concerned about the rules and the details of not working on the Sabbath to the point that they missed the point of the very Sabbath which God brought for them. All of the rules around the Sabbath thwarted that very purpose of replenishing and healing. And Jesus healing the man's hand went against their rules, but accomplished the very purpose of the Sabbath. You see, Jesus' anger and grief was at something deeper. And the stubbornness of these men's hearts was just the very symptom of that deeper thing. Notice what Jesus says when they're in the grain fields. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We could say it another way if we sort of maybe take a little bit broader view and say the law of God was made for man. Man was not made for God's law. It's interesting. We use that term law quite a bit. We see it all throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. I was talking with T-Bone when he was here, and he's actually taking a course in Hebrew right now. And he said he's actually taking this course with Jewish rabbis. And so he said, we got to this point where we're talking about the word law, and he said, the Jewish rabbi said, actually that word law, he said, you Westerners have sort of taken it and put it and given it a completely different meaning. The word that is there is the Hebrew word Torah. And the Jewish rabbis said it actually means instruction. Rather than this whole rule of law meant to break us, instruction is meant to guide us. And so what we could see here, what we could say is the Sabbath, the law, the instruction is a gift from a loving God, not a burden from a tyrannical God. The Sabbath was meant to help man, not to hurt him. And so if we really look at this, then here is the source of Jesus' anger and grief. That his word, that the Jews have had for so long, because Jesus is the word of God. The word that he gave, which was meant to bring freedom, which was meant to bring a better way of living, had been used, had been molded to enslave and be a burden upon these people. That the people became more focused on the details of law and getting it right rather than the meaning of the instruction. To understand this, let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to Genesis 2. When all that God gave was one instruction. He said, I don't want you to eat that one tree. Now you notice, God never tells or gives the reason why. He doesn't say why not to eat from that tree. All he says is don't eat from it. And I think what he's getting at there is he is wanting not just a certain type of behavior from man, but he is wanting the very idea of a relationship. He's saying, I want you to obey out of love and trust. Because that you know that I am God and you're not. And I will have your best interest at heart. But Satan comes along. And notice what Satan does. The serpent says, this law of God, it isn't a gift to you. It's something completely different. What the serpent says is the serpent says, he is keeping you from something because he said, if you're to eat of this tree, you will become like God. Well, think about what the serpent is really doing. He's giving man FOMO, fear of missing out. Wait a minute, if I eat this, I'm going to be like God, and God's preventing me from doing this? You see, the lie of the snake is don't trust God. And when we see God's instruction as that law, we don't trust him. And that is the lie that is in all of our hearts. Let me just show you how that is. Think about it in this way. Think about religion versus the gospel. How do we view God's instruction? Did you note how the Pharisees added details to God's instruction for rest? We all have a choice of how we view God's instruction. We can view it in the eyes of religion, or we can view it through the eyes of the gospel. And by religion, I just want you to think about all of the religions out there. How is it that they go about doing things? You see, religion would say the very purpose of law is to assure that you are okay with God. But if that's the case, then obedience is a burden. Because you have to work really hard to get all the things right to assure that you are a good person. And if you perform, then you are accepted. But in the gospel, the very purpose of it is to train your heart to delight in God. Obedience, then, if we look at it in that light, obedience becomes a gift because you're already accepted in Jesus Christ. It's not about trying to make it up, to earn your way. Jesus says, you're good. The instruction takes you out of yourself and shows you a life of love that you want to live because of what God has done for you. Religion would say, do the law, then God owes you something. The idea that you do this and then you're going to be a good person. And so therefore God will answer your prayers, or he will bless you, or he'll take you to heaven. But think about what happens when we do this. As a result, we begin to focus on the details. We need to know exactly what to do so that I can be a good person. I need whatever the details are so that I can measure myself. Circle back. That's where the introduction comes in. Do you ever feel like you do that yourself? Just let me know what the details are so that I can get it right. The gospel says God, through Jesus, gives you complete salvation by grace. The instruction shows how to love God and others instead of being absorbed in self. Religion says, you don't look at the broad meaning of the law. Instead, focus on the details, even the ones that aren't there, to give assurance that you are obeying in the right way. Notice how the Pharisees were doing that. God said, rest on this day. Okay, well, we need to make sure that we rest. And so here's all these other things that will pin us in, that will block us into right here. We've hedged ourselves in so that we know we're doing the right thing. But they missed the very meaning of the Sabbath rest. The gospel says the desire is to see the broad purpose of instruction. That it's about the motivation of the heart and less concern about the details. Let me give you an example. Jesus says, here are the greatest commands. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. But most of us go, yeah, but I need you to fill in the gaps. What does that look like? Love God. Love others as yourself. Yeah, I know, Jesus, but can you please give me some examples? What does that mean? I need to know so that I can get it right. Jesus says, you're missing the point. I want you to just love. Well, yeah, but what if that looks different for somebody over here than for me? Love. You see, how many times we want the details. We like to box ourselves in, to say, I need to just know so I can be right. Religion says you're saved by being better than everyone else. That when you focus on all of these compliances with the details, then you begin to feel better about yourself because you look at yourself and say, okay, well, I'm doing this and this and this. You know what? That person over there, they're not doing that. I am such a good person. Man, I have got this all down pat. The gospel says you're only saved if you admit you are no better than anyone else. You see, in looking at that instruction of God, it humbles us because we know we cannot live up to it. And yet God gives grace and He loves us in spite of our failures, so that we say, I'm going to do my best to live for Him in the life of love that He wants for me to live. Now, let me just make a clarification. Because I imagine there's probably someone here who heard me say it's not about the details, and you went, wait a minute, what? I'm not saying that the details that are given in the gospel are insignificant. What I am saying is that we have a tendency to just want the list. Give it to me in black and white so that I can do it, so that I can say, I'm good. But that's not what God wants from us. I was talking with Dwayne this week about this very idea, and it's sort of like this. It's really the contrast of painting the Mona Lisa and painting the Mona Lisa by numbers. If you're the one who's painting the Mona Lisa, you're using your creativity. You're using the ideas of brushstrokes and let's blend this color with this color. And you see the fullness of that come through in that painting. Whereas if you're just painting by numbers, you're like, oh, okay, blue is green and red is 5, and so I need to paint here. And the whole idea is you're just going through the motions. Give me this, done. There's a complete difference in the one who paints the Mona Lisa and the one who paints by numbers. And God is saying, I don't want you to focus on painting by numbers. Let's take this illustration a little bit further. Let's consider a child doing a painting for their parents. And maybe they sort of paint outside the lines. Maybe it doesn't look just so. But what does the parent do? Does the parent look at the drawing or the painting and go, that's terrible, go back to the drawing board? No. The parent takes that. And where does that painting go? On the refrigerator. It is right there for everyone else to see. What I want you to see is that's how God works with us. He says, here's my instruction. Go live your life. Don't be so caught up in the details. And don't put more details in there that I didn't put in. And so that when we bring our portrait to Him, it may not look like the Mona Lisa painting. But He says, you know what? This is going up on my wall because I love you. That's the very idea that Jesus is trying to get across. Especially when He says, I am Lord of the Sabbath. Because here's the challenge. That lie of the serpent is in our hearts, and we default to religion if we're not careful. That's why we need reminders of the gospel every day. That we have to ask ourselves, Right now, am I living a life of religion or am I living out of the gospel? When Jesus says, I am Lord of the Sabbath, notice he's not just saying, I have the authority to change the Sabbath. He doesn't even say, I'm Lord over the Sabbath. The very word Sabbath means to cease. It means deep rest and peace. Jesus is saying, I am Lord of rest. Now think about what that means. Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He's the very source of rest. If we go all the way back to the beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, God rested after creation. It's not that God was tired. It's that he had finished his work. It is done. It is complete. There's nothing else that is needed. And so he now rests, or he sits, if you will, and enjoys his creation. That's what it means. And we need to cease from our work. Again, as I've said, God didn't make us to be creatures who work 24/7. Hebrews speaks of the very idea that we are to enter into a rest that is reserved for us. We need to stop our physical and mental work sometimes. I think it's interesting that Jesus says that man was not made for the Sabbath. Notice he didn't say Jews were not made for the Sabbath. He said man. Meaning the very idea that all of us were meant to have rest. Rest from a physical standpoint. But I love, as one preacher put it, he says, there is a deeper work that we need to cease from. There is a deeper work that is under the work. And that is the rest for our soul. Because deep down, we still believe the serpent's lie. And so that work that seems to be under everything else is that need to prove ourselves, that need to justify our existence, that need to, I've got to be a good person, and so I need to do X and this and Y and Z and all of this so that I will be good enough. You see, after creation, God really said, it is finished. And on the cross, Jesus said, it is finished. What did he mean by that? It means that Jesus takes it all away. The work of proving ourselves, the work of holding on to rules and traditions of religion. He says, I've wiped all of that out because I lived the life that you should have lived. I died the death that you should have died. So that now we can rest in him. Yes, I think in all of us there's a sense where we say, I don't know if I can trust God. That just seems to be in our nature. But when we begin to look at the cross, that lie of Satan begins to crumble. Because we see what Jesus did for us. That because of what he has done, now I can say I can trust in God. And because of what Jesus has done, God looks at you and me and says, I am pleased with you. You are good. It's not about what we do. It's about who we are because of Jesus Christ. You see, when Jesus came to earth, we didn't get a religion. we got a person. A person who made it possible for us to rest in him. So I ask you this morning, are you holding onto a religion, or are you living in the gospel? That's Jesus' invitation to us, to come to him, because he will give rest. He says, you don't have to work. It's not about doing enough. He said, I've completed it. I've taken care of it. You are good in me. What do you need this morning? Maybe you look at your life and say, I'm struggling. I keep trying to do it myself. And the reality is, you're not going to be good enough. None of us are. It is through the grace of Jesus that we can stand before God holy and righteous. So if you need prayers this morning, or if you want to become the child of God, he offers that invitation for you this morning to become brand new through the waters of baptism, to become his son or daughter, and to rest in the fact that he loves you because you're good in Jesus Christ. If you need that this morning, won't you come? Let's together we stand and sing.